Hello and welcome to Coming Home Network Presents, where we explore the kinds of questions people wrestle with when they are looking into the Catholic Church and wondering if they should become a part of it. Today we get to talk about fiction and the Christian imagination. This is something that is often kind of a bit of a culture shock when it comes to people who come from maybe evangelical backgrounds, who are exploring the way that Catholics make and write fiction. So I'm very excited today to talk to a couple of Catholics who have written novels and fiction and get their perspective on what it was like to do that as evangelical Christians and what they do it like now as Catholics. You can check out the Coming Home Network at CHNetwork.org. We got lots of great resources there. We also have an online community. It's free to join. And you can encounter others who are maybe asking the same kind of questions you are, and that is community.chnetwork.org. Of course, this is all made possible because of the generous support of our partners in mission, and you can join them at chnetwork.org/compass. So I'm joined today by Rhonda Ortiz and Lorelei Savaryn. They are both writers. They both have backgrounds and different kinds of Christianity. Actually, we could probably fill a bingo card with all the different kinds of Christianity that the two of you have been involved in. Rhonda works with a publication called Dabbled Things. Lorelei's got some books from Penguin Random House, and we're going to get into those in a little bit. But first of all, welcome to both of you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Matt. We appreciate it.
Yeah, so both of you have been guests on The Journey Home, where you've shared the story of how you became Catholic. So we won't get too much into the narrative of all that here, but I do want to, I'll start with you, Lorelei. What was your experience of fiction written by Christians in your days as an evangelical, especially in like the 90s? Because I know that you and I have a lot of overlap of experience of this world.
We sure do. So I was a very bookish kid, so I read a lot as I was becoming a teenager in the late 90s. So middle school was kind of where I was at, and then going into high school. And I definitely was in an evangelical zone where secular stuff was bad. So like there was a really long stretch where I only listened to Christian music and like secular music was bad. So with books, it was a little bit more fluid than that. I had a lot of books that I read back then that were just general fiction. But I also think that children's literature back then was a lot more friendly to the Christian worldview than it currently is. But then I also read in the Christian realm as well. The Left Behind series would probably be something that very much stands out in my memory and was a big part of my personality for the years that it was coming out. Redeeming Love was another one that I think that was a fictional depiction of a story from the Old Testament, Isaiah maybe. So there were definitely Christian books in my world, but I also just sought fiction that was uplifting, generally speaking. So that's kind of the short story.
So Rhonda, you have a really interesting encounter with the great books on which your story very much turns, but did you have much experience of this kind of world growing up?
Not really. Not really. I definitely listened to Christian music, but I didn't read Christian fiction. So I knew it existed. I think by the time I was old enough to, turn to adult fiction, I was reading the classics. So, and, even as like a high schooler, I was like, I want to read something important. The only novel that, Christian fiction novel that I did read was Christie by Catherine Marshall. And that is a touchstone book, and it's actually very good. And I could say that today. It's actually a very good book. It's very evangelical, but it's a very good book. So I actually walked into the Christian market realm, or like awareness of it, actually very recently, owing not to my work with Dappled Things, which is a Catholic literary magazine, but to my work with Chrism Press, which is a Catholic and Orthodox Christian fiction imprint under a Christian market umbrella, Whitefire Publishing. So it's definitely a different cut in.
Yeah, very much so. So I'll give you, Rhonda, since you don't have a lot of experience with this, let me just catch you up to speed. So my experience of this world was in the 90s, and I also was in a kind of a world where I mean, looking back, it's sort of laughable what we would like object to or boycott being like taught in English classes because of how much different the world has changed. And so it was the general, like you get the Weekly Reader and the Scholastic Book Fair, and you didn't have like the range of stuff you've got today. But we did still kind of aim towards Christian fiction. And I worked at Family Christian Store for a number of years, and we had a fiction section. And Lorelei, you can fill me in if I'm leaving any of these major genres out, but we had a few major genres. One would be like the spiritual warfare thriller. So like Frank Peretti's Piercing the Darkness and This Present Darkness, and there are a few others kind of in that realm. Another would be like end times adventure fiction. You mentioned Left Behind, but there were like a ton of books in that genre, whole sections. There was also a whole bunch of sort of like allegorical fiction, a la Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan or Hind's Feet in High Places. You know, a lot of really kind of hit you over the head with like, oh, this character is named after the virtue or the lesson that they're going to teach you by the end of the book. So had some of that. Also had a smaller subgenre of like Screwtape Letters fan fiction of people who kind of tried to write their own versions of the Screwtape Letters, you know, adapted to various audiences. Biblical fiction was a little bit dicey. We didn't have as much of that in Family Christian Store, I think in part because people were worried of adding to the scriptures, or maybe it might not go over well if they, you know, and you actually see some of that, by the way, in the way people, you know, respond to things like The Chosen. Like people get a little bit edgy about messing with the stories they love.
Yeah.
And then historical fiction, there was, interestingly enough, and Rhonda, you may have encountered some of this in your work, a strong strain of like messianic Judaism in some of the historic fiction that we sold. So I'm not sure why that was, but I'd say probably the biggest section was either the small town cottage or Amish prairie romance section of the bookstore. And we used to have a blast with this. And I'm really interested in Rhonda's experience of this because you've lived a little bit kind of in relation to this world. But when we would get a box of these in, and people would just crank these out. It'd be like 5 stories to a book. And so we'd have like public readings of the synopsis on the back of these stories in the receiving room at Family Christian. And they usually went something like this. Nettie Hubbard grew up in the Flynn Creek community and had given herself heart and soul to it. However, she'd yet to find love, and she wondered if God was even listening to her prayers for a suitor. So when Caleb McDowell, a handsome young drifter, showed up in town, Nettie wondered if it might be the hand of Providence. But would she be able to tame his wild heart in a way that he'd turn it over to her, but also turn it over to the Lord? This is kind of...
Yes.
It's always been my dream to like ghost write one of those. So that was the world of it. So when I thought about Christian fiction, I thought, among other things, that it had to be very clearly teaching a lesson, very clearly making a sale, and very clearly something that someone could pick up and by the end of it being like, oh, this is what this is the conclusion I'm supposed to draw at the end of it. Lorelei, was that your experience at all?
Oh yeah, 100%. I feel like, I mean, the evangelicalness of it, right? It was evangelizing through fiction. And I think maybe that is a key marker of that kind of fiction. Was now as a Catholic, I think that fiction can tell a good story, a story that resonates with something very deep inside the human experience. It doesn't necessarily have to be explicit evangelism to work or be good. And the evangelical fiction that I encountered in those years, it was like Left Behind was like, well, you better be ready for the rapture because it's coming. And here's how that could play out. And the Amish romances, like there was always a very explicit faith, like you're trying to sell the faith component to those stories as well. So yeah, that brings me right back.
So this is why I really want to pick Rhonda's brain about this, because she experienced this backwards, right? So a lot of people go through the evangelical world and experience this, and then they discover the great books. Whereas you, Rhonda, you discovered the great books, and then you began more writing, and then you sort of kind of encountered like this broad range of Christians trying to write fiction. So how did that strike you when you encountered it?
Well, I think, I definitely, the back cover blurb that you just rattled off, Matt, is definitely, I think I went in with that assumption.
I wrote that, by the way. I want to make sure that I'm not plagiarizing. I wrote that.
I'm going to hire you to be our marketing person. Just kidding. But I think it was we had, so I went in when I wrote I had a manuscript. I spent, 7 years not writing that particular manuscript, but working on my craft and writing things and putting them in the desk drawer, and writing another one, putting in the desk drawer. And when I finally had a book I was ready to publish, I didn't know where it was supposed to go, because not only am I a Catholic and it takes up Catholic themes, but it's also involves Protestants set in the late 18th century in Boston, where they talked about this stuff. Actually, Matt, I think you know this, but Mark Grodi, after I was done recording,
y'all got real nerdy.
Oh, yeah. My goodness, because he's done all this research on that time period, and he was telling me, he said, the first priest in Boston he and other pastors would debate the faith back and forth, and it was reprinted in papers all up and down the coast. I mean, and so so that's a very historical thing, and you write I don't know where I'm going to put this, because I'm staying close to the historicity of this time period. And so I was like, well, my best shot is probably with the Christian market. And I think at that point had started to read a little bit of Christian fiction based on different recommendations that people had made for me. But I didn't really have like a really good sense of it. But I did know that there were a couple of books where I had been introduced to that were willing to take up harder themes. So they weren't just in the vein that you had just rattled off. All of the things from the 90s, I was being introduced to like the cream of the crop. And I was like, oh, okay, the cream of the crop. I mean, I know about that Amish fiction stuff, but there's also a cream of the crop, and that they're willing to do this. And so I ended up, eventually going sort of sideways into it. And that's a very long story. I won't get into it, but yeah. So it was like, okay, I need to read in this market to know what it is that I'm going into, because there is absolutely no way the secular market is going to pick up my book. But at the same time, I'm not evangelical. This book is not a flat evangelicalism. It's not vanilla. Like, it has denominations. It has people who are arguing because that's what they did. So it was hard to figure out. But yeah, it was at that point, it was like when I was ready to start shopping around a manuscript, I was like, okay, what market am I going to put this in? I better start reading.
This is so funny for so many reasons. I'm so glad to get the two of you together, because you have such fascinating and nuanced perspectives on this. Because you, Rhonda, you came into the church, began writing as a Catholic, and ended up talking with evangelicals about getting your work published. Lorelei, you came from an evangelical world, became Catholic, but you've been only really published in like the secular, your fiction's been published in secular publications.
Yep.
So did you have a similar worry? Like, I don't know who's going to want to publish this stuff that I'm writing.
So this is still something that I am discerning my way through. My first novel, middle grade, was not explicitly religious in any way. It's a story about a girl who goes into a magical circus built of dreams and nightmares. And there's obviously pieces of my faith in it, but I sort of knew that to break in to that market, that I probably needed to not like be super overt about things right away. And that's in large part due to the fact that the secular market is really unfriendly towards Christian worldviews right now, more maybe than it ever has been. But then I had a 2-book deal. So I sold 2 books in one to Penguin. And my second book, I just decided to see what I could get away with. And I ended up writing basically a magical Catholic retelling of The Secret Garden. And there were points where I was turning in rounds of edits, and I was like, when are they going to email me back and be like, this is too religious? And they never did. And then it got published, and I have like bad reviews on Goodreads from people being like, the further I read, the more Catholic it became. And I didn't expect to read a Catholic allegory. And, but I just kind of chuckled because I was like, I got it in. And then my third book, I was able to write in a Catholic character into the book, so that there's this representation of a young Catholic person in the story. But all that is to say, the marketing money from my publisher did not come through to support my books that were more religious themed. So they exist, but I definitely got a lot more marketing for my first book than I did for my second and third, which is interesting.
Yeah, so it's interesting for a number of reasons, and on a number of levels. One is that the Catholic today doesn't exactly know where to put their stuff, right? Because there's resonances with like a Christian evangelical world, but it's not a fit, right? There's resonances with sort of like a general human desire for wonder, but it's not a full fit. Much like we don't fit in with Martin Luther or the pagans. We just don't. It's just not who we are. But it strikes me that there have been places that the Catholic imagination has fit in through the years and through the centuries. So if I were to go back now and talk about who are the greatest like people who wrote from the Christian imagination, I would tell you people like Dostoevsky or Tolkien or Flannery O'Connor or Walker Percy or Graham Greene or G.K. Chesterton. There's like loads of them. What's interesting to me is they all have this unique thing in common, and that is they all come from like a sacramental kind of expression of Christianity. So either Orthodox or Anglican or Catholic. So I want to dig into why it is that J.R.R. Tolkien seems to get more people asking questions about the church than a lot of these Christian novels maybe out there, or even a lot of apologetics texts. I meet people all the time who their first introduction to Catholicism was the worldview of Tolkien. Rhonda, you're a great books person. Like, why do you think that is?
It's really interesting, right? I think I'm going to butcher the quote, but, Flannery O'Connor talks about, being a Catholic and being a novelist and being a Catholic novelist, that it's, at the bottom of this, you still have to be a good novelist, in order to be a Catholic novelist. And you can't ride the Catholicity to your story has to be a story. So, and I think there's the things that have endured are the good stories. But I think the sacramental worldview allows for stories to stand on their own a little bit better than an evangelical one. And I think it's not that. I think for a couple of reasons. One, there's room for mystery. Like, you don't have to explain everything. And then two, which from a crafts perspective, from when we write, the one of the fundamental rules of writing is show, don't tell, right? And it's like show, don't tell. so we have, and so if you have an imagination you have a scope of imagination that is showing and embodied without telling, then there's more room for this, I think the other thing that comes to my mind, and Lorelei can add on to this, is that because, actually it's probably related, the evangelical experience of faith is spoken. It's all in the word. It's all in the written word. It's in the Bible. This is the expression of their faith is through testimony. It's through conveying an experience that they've had, a religious experience that they've had. At least this is the way that I grew up. And so there's not like, in order to write religion, in order to write faith, they wouldn't even say the word religion. In order to write the faith, you have to speak it. You can't just knead it into the dough in the same way. And so that's the tendency. And I think, so this is why evangelicals will read Christian market fiction and they don't, people will say, oh, it's so preachy, da, 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 da. I think preachy is actually a big bugaboo word, but we won't go with that. But the problem is like almost like a religious cultural one. And they don't hear the spoken part of the religious expression as preachiness, because that's how it's expressed. Whereas I think a Catholic would go in and be like, like too much, So I think there's a number of different levels. And I think probably more important is the fact that it's almost like there's a dome over the evangelical expression in their faith, where it's like there's no room for mystery. Because of sacraments point to mysteries. Sacraments are embodied mysteries, if you will, like they're incarnational pieces, and they point beyond themselves. And we could get into sacramental theology, but these are places where we touch the divine. And if you don't have that experience, it's hard to there's the imagination expands when you're in receiving the sacraments and really meditating on them. So that's a little bit long-winded, and I'm not entirely sure it's very
It's great though. It's very, I think you're onto something. Lorelei, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah. I think this builds off of what you were saying nicely. So when I'm in the secular publishing space, something I notice, and my world is children's literature, is that there's a lot of focus on the body, but not the soul. So there's even like the young adult, middle grade, it's just, there's this lack of connection to that there's something bigger than us. So a lot of it is emphasizing kids, going through puberty, like growing up, but it's all like kind of focused on the bodily experience, the here and now, with no afterthought of like the implications of choices or virtue or anything like that. So there's that. And then you have evangelical fiction, where at least my experience of an evangelical and in reading books is it's an overemphasis on the soul and a disconnect from the body sometimes, because ultimately our souls are not our body, or like we are not our bodies and our souls. In evangelical, at least where I grew up, it was you are a soul who's kind of in a body, but your body doesn't really matter as much as your soul does. That's the only main thing. So I think that translates into the fiction and into art, is there's this lack of connection and importance of our bodies in this messy human experience that can't always be tied up neatly with a ribbon. And then being a Catholic and writing and having that integration that I am my body and my soul together, it opens up things to be deeper and to be truer, and for you to wrestle with the messy stuff and not lose sight of virtue, to be here in this body, in this skin, and have these very human, not always pretty experiences, but the soul and virtue and the incarnate inside us, like incarnation and God and image of God and all these things. And that all can be integrated in the Catholic artistic space in a way that I think secular publishing and evangelical publishing can't quite do. I don't know if that made sense either.
Oh, it makes sense.
That's really interesting.
What it means is that 1700 years later, we're still fighting the Arian heresy and the Gnostic error. Like this is all these, and so because I have such a deep love for evangelicals, I want to make sure that that my evangelical brothers and sisters don't misunderstand what I'm about to say. But I didn't realize how low my Christology was until I started to become a Catholic. I didn't have the full humanity of Christ and the full divinity of Christ sort of reconciled in this hypostatic union that allowed me to not be afraid of things like the church or Mary. Because if you've got that right Christology, then Mary is almost like an artistic expression of Christology, right? The church is almost like this artistic expression of an extension of your Christology. But if you're treating Christianity as a purely spiritual reality, that limits kind of the ways that you can express all these different things. I think about this in terms of, my primary experience of making stuff creatively was in the music world, in the Christian music industry. And in some sense, we had a first line of defense we had to get through before we could start actually making art. And that was to prove to the Christian parents that our music was Christian enough for their kids to listen to, right? And so often so much energy was spent on that in the Christian music industry that by the time it came for somebody to try and do something that was maybe a little creative or whatever, then they'd spin all their chips and all the kids thought they were cheesy, or the people who had latched onto them because they were so evangelistic now are like, oh, well, they're not as evangelistic as they used to be now. So I mean, there's a lot of that kind of is like really in tension. And I'll give you a great example of kind of like a Catholic versus evangelical difference here. So we sold Chronicles of Narnia hand over fist at Family Christian Store in the 90s. I mean, it was wild. People come in and just buy those things. They buy like 16 different sets, with the books, all the different numbers and all the stuff. But in the late 90s, when word came out that they were going to be doing some movies based on Lord of the Rings, we didn't carry Lord of the Rings. So we started carrying Lord of the Rings, but we weren't exactly sure how to handle them and market them and where to put them and how to explain it when people were like, is this a Christian book? Because in Narnia, Aslan is clearly Jesus. In the Lord of the Rings, you can't be like, well, is Frodo Jesus? Like, you can't. That's not the thing that Tolkien is doing. And yet what he's doing is profoundly Christian in so many ways. But there wasn't like people wanted to be able to say, this is our Christian literary moment, but they weren't sure exactly like how it was their Christian literary moment, if that makes sense. Rhonda, did you have something to share on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, like, that there's this tendency to want to be able to, I mean, it's almost like your God is too small sort of thing, right? Like we want to be able to explain everything and may have it be tidy. And like the word, I always feel like the word with the phrase, the catchphrase, I think as evangelicals, I hear this a lot. And this is it's just about following Jesus. And it's the word just that there's a kind of, in one sense, there's a certain, inclusivity about that. It's just about following Jesus. So that includes us too, yeah, absolutely includes a lot of people, everybody across the Christian spectrum. But it's also is that there's no space for branching out into maybe typographical understandings, or like you were saying, that Mary is an artistic expression, like Mary herself is a sort of art form of Christology. Like, okay, like where did, how do you make that jump? You can't just say that, So that's not an easily understood piece. So I think it's, that like desire to kind of like, I need to be able to explain everything under the umbrella of it's just about following Jesus, and like going out beyond that doesn't like compute necessarily. You're like, oh, I kind of get that this is Christian, but I also don't. I was also going to say, Matt, your experience about, running into this kind of wall in Christian music of like having to prove yourself, like proving that your virtue or whatever, is proving your faith. I have my local writing group. We are a walk into a bar group, joke. And so it's me, one Reformed Christian, one Lutheran, a kind of charismatic evangelical who's at a small church, not a big church, kind of more of a house church, and then one evangelical she's brand new to the group, so I won't speak on her behalf. But it's I think
you just named every single one of Lorelei's previous churches.
Yeah, hey.
I'm here. Yeah, so this is, we were speaking the same language. Anyway, it's really interesting, the folks in my group, my writing partners, because they know the Christian market pretty well, but there's a constant frustration around the word, like around what am I allowed to write this thing that I'm working on? I really want to say it this way, but I'm not allowed to write this. And they're very kind of like attuned to the Christian market. And it's like what they are allowed to write, what they're not allowed to write. Two of those people are more mainline. They're not evangelicals at all. And so they have a higher, either a deeper theology or a higher sacramental reality in the case of my Lutheran friend. And so, so there's even pieces like that where they feel a little bit confined. That said, what I've noticed, you still have the tripe of like, that Matt's blurb, kind of like outlined, right? You still have this kind of mass market stuff. You have that in every market, you have that secular market too. But what's interesting to me is that the evangelical market increasingly is publishing books where everybody's covering a lot of really hard topics, but they're bound by having to prove themselves. Like they're still bound by like, oh, we don't want to like fully upset anybody. So we have to like be very careful about how we portray these really hard topics. And then on top of that, like we don't have like deep means for reconciling or like for meeting the characters. The characters don't have a deep enough spiritual life or like a deep enough ecclesiology to actually handle the deep problems that they have. So I rambled.
Yeah.
Let me like redirect here to Matt. Okay.
No, I'm very curious. Yeah, Lorelei, that's
so,
absolutely.
I can relate to the like, can I write this kind of thing? I'm very grateful that I went into publishing after converting to Catholicism, because I write books with scary things in them for kids. Like my books have ghosts in them. They have monsters. One of them has a moment with a creepy clown. And these things I feel like would all just be very off limits for me with my prior worldview. And I think it's very important for kids to read books where there are actually I have it's on the wall behind me. It's a G.K. Chesterton paraphrase that says fairy tales are more than true, not because they tell us that dragons exist, but because they tell us that dragons can be beaten. And so I think it's very important in children's literature to have kids facing very scary things and seeing good triumph in the end, and that evil is ultimately defeated. And you can't have the same power if you have a weak villain that you can if you have a villain who's truly scary. And we can look at these great books, right? The White Witch. We can look at Tolkien, and we can see all of these very scary, haunting villains. And part of the reasons why these stories are so powerful is because the evil is so very real, and that makes the good triumphing all the more. But I joke with my priest, and he has confirmed that I write theologically plausible ghosts in my books, so they're plausible in the realm of Catholic theology. and I'm not scaring kids just to scare them, but I'm scaring them because there's a point, because good will win in the end. But I think as an evangelical, I wouldn't have even dared to try to write some of the things that I've written.
Yeah, and actually, just thinking through the people who write in the Gothic vein in the evangelical market today, it's always a Scooby-Doo, right? There's never, like, you can't venture out into a preternatural or supernatural speculation. You have to keep it within an empirical, Enlightenment bound, Protestant bound worldview. There's no space for the literary conceits of the Gothic. The literary, like there's no space for vampires or werewolves or anything like that, even though as a literary device, they have real meaning. My friend Eleanor Borg Nicholson, who writes in the classic Gothic vein, and she writes both for Chrism Press for us, but she also writes. She's written for Ignatius. She's done all these critical editions for Ignatius Press, and her thing is like, her big thing is it's the funhouse mirror, right? These are literary devices that show our weaknesses, our sins, in exaggerated forms, right? In order to show us a truth. Sin is ugly. Sin is big. It's ugly. Evil is ugly. It is powerful. It can ruin lives. And we need to see that in literary forms as well, and that there's a space for this. And you don't have that in the evangelical world. Everything is like I said, everything's a Scooby-Doo. And that's really like, there's not and that's not to say that the editors are not that they're not informed by literary tradition. I bet they would love Eleanor's books. I bet they would love Lorelei's books. Like, that's not to say that, but there's a market consideration that they're like, oh, you can't do that. We can't sell it. It has to be a Scooby-Doo because we can't sell this to an evangelical market otherwise.
So the first person who really broke all this open to me, because again, I'd been just roundly mocking a lot of this stuff when it came in the boxes in the receiving room at the store, and we put it out there. And, I read a couple of them. And so I was working the late 90s, early 2000s, and everything was like really peaking in a lot of evangelical marketing. And at one point we were pre-selling the Left Behind books, 12 months in advance, and somebody came up and was like, hey, when's the next Left Behind book coming out? Do you know what it's called? I was like, it's called The Boils. And I'm like, because there's going to be a lot of boils at the end of the world. I was just so cynical about it and so done. But then as I was making music, nobody wants to name their Christian band or album or anything like that after a title from modern contemporary Christian fiction. Like, you want to go into like Dante if you want to sound metal, right? You want to go into like some of these others, and that was part of my my journey towards discovering kind of like a different kind of Christian aesthetic and a different kind of Christian way of telling stories and doing art. And that's when I came across Flannery O'Connor. And Flannery O'Connor really, Chesterton he changed the game, but he was safe for me because I'd read Lewis. Flannery O'Connor was like writing about my relatives. She was writing about like real stuff. And I don't think when I read Flannery O'Connor, she's thinking to herself, am I allowed to write about this? Like, it's all on the table. But recently, a few years ago, Dr. Benjamin Alexander put out a book of it's called Good Things Out of Nazareth. It's a book of her letters. And she wrote something, and this maybe can launch us to sort of the last part of this discussion that I wanted to get to. She's writing to Father James McCown, a good friend of hers, and she wrote, "It seems to me that you don't have to rely on the virtue of prudence to prevent pornography in your writing, but you must first anyway rely on the virtue of art. Pornography and sentimentality and anything else in excess are all sins against form. And I think they ought to be approached as sins against art rather than sins against morality," which is a wild insight. But it sort of struck me like, how can Flannery O'Connor write stuff that's so dark in some ways, but know where the line is, right? Because in a certain way, it's like when a movie cuts away right before something terrible is about to happen, because it sort of like allows the space in the reader's mind or the viewer's mind to kind of draw a conclusion, and that there's a sort of freedom in that that is allowed with a sacramental worldview that's not allowed in a purely sort of didactic worldview. So I guess my question is, if somebody came up to you and just asked, well, you were an evangelical and now you're a Catholic, like, how does that change your writing? Like, how did that change the way you write, Lorelei?
Oh man, I know for certain that none of my 3 books would have come out this way, or even that like I could have attempted them to the quality that they needed to be at least for me. Like, I couldn't have written them to the quality it needed to be at to be picked up by Penguin before I was Catholic. And I think that's because there's such a depth to sink into and such an integratedness. And I'm always at the forefront of my mind. I'm thinking I'm writing books for children, and I'm thinking about their souls, right? And I'm thinking about the important things that they need to learn. But I'm able to delve into those messy places. Like in my first book, I've got a character whose parents are divorced, and she's got a lot of pain with that. And I have another book where there's a character who has anxiety, and the second one is grief. And all of these are really, really messy things. And they're really important to not prescribe solutions to, but they're things that kids deal with, right? We have kids dealing with divorce. We have kids dealing with grief, kids dealing with anxiety. And it's not something that you can just tie up and just say, okay, everyone's happily ever after now. Just kidding. The boogeyman's not real, because it is real. It is real for a lot of kids. And so for me, becoming a Catholic writer gives me space to give children a story that contains truth and hope and goodness, but does not negate or write off the actual pain and messiness of human existence. And that's probably the best I can say on it, is how that informs everything I write for kids. And that's large part in due to being Catholic.
How about you, Rhonda?
I want to pick up on that because the happily ever after in this life is something that you see. It's an expectation, both in popular fiction, both in the secular market, but also in evangelical fiction, right? Like ambiguous endings are not welcome. Not having, like, we want this simple solution. It's just believe in Jesus. Just all it is about following, it's just about following Jesus, right? We want a simple solution. But then you realize that, like, things are not so simple, right? And I think, I was thinking, you think about like what happens at funerals, right? If you go to an evangelical funeral, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes you'll hear somebody say, you need to be happy. Like, the proper response is that they are in heaven and they are rejoicing with the Lord, and there's no room for mourning, right? And it's like, I think in a Catholic worldview, like, we have ways of mourning, and like we have a space for this. Even if we have our hope is in the resurrection, we have a space for this. And so, how does this impact the writing? Well, I know that, for the first few things I wrote that won't ever see the light of day, I definitely wanted a happily ever after. And then I started writing the book that, the first book of the series that I'm currently, publishing and writing at the same time. Don't ever do that, by the way. I got to, so the front story is a romance, and I got to the solution of the courtship. Like, the courtship culminated, but the real problem, the human problem with my character, that she has this horrible rift with her dead father, wasn't solved. And that's life. Like, that's life. And you could have this, like, and she, there's the culmination of the courtship. There's even a kind of conversion moment right there at the end, but it's a conversion moment that still acknowledges the fact that she is not reconciled with her dad. And then at that point I was like, oh, I'm writing more books. We're going into marriage. All right. Let's shift in gear. Like, I don't know how to do that, because it doesn't fit a neat, tidy, genre happily ever after mold.
I remember reading that in Flannery O'Connor talking about writing her stories. Like, she doesn't write necessarily with an end in mind. She writes with a character in mind, right? Or Dorothy L. Sayers talks about this as well. Like, you have to give a little freedom to what's happening as it happens. But that all being said, I want to make sure that before I let you all go, I feel like we've scratched the surface, and rather than tie all this together in a nice little bow, which would be the antithesis of everything Rhonda just said, we'll leave a little mystery out there, but at least steer people towards your projects. So, Rhonda, if people want to find some of the stuff you've written and are working on, how do they do so?
All right, so you can use my find my work on my website, rhondaortiz.com, and I'm also, like I said, so I have 2 novels out in this particular series. They are through Chrism Press. How that ended up being founded was me shopping this manuscript around, the first one, and in the process of doing that, the owners of the publishing company I work for said, hey, we should start a Catholic imprint, and you can be one of our first manuscripts. Oh, and by the way, can you come on board as an editor? Anyways, so I was like, okay, that's a big jump. It was amazing. It was really God inspired. So that's chrismpress.com. We have about 24 titles we founded in 2020, and we are in the 2 dozens and going strong. I'm also editor-in-chief of Dappled Things at, like, the Gerard Manley Hopkins home. Glory be to God for Dappled Things. And that is dappledthings.org.
Very good. Now, Lorelei, your turn
Yes.
to tell people where to go find their stuff, especially for people who are looking for good stuff for their kids to read. I can't tell you how often people come to me and are like, do you have good stuff that my kids can read?
Yes. I truly, on that note, one of my greatest hopes is that more Catholic publishers will invest in children's middle grade and young adult fiction in the years to come, just because of how much more difficult it is to find things that are traditionally published in the mainstream that we feel really good about handing to our kids. But in the meantime, I'm here, and I have The Night Train came out this past year. It's a story about a ghost train, but it also features a Catholic character who loves his faith very much, and he has a very helpful role in the journey in his theology and understanding of supernatural things within a Catholic lens. So that was kind of my answer to a lot of middle grade books having tarot cards and Ouija boards and seances and things in them. I wanted to write a book with ghosts that didn't violate like what we could believe as Catholics. I have The Edge of In Between, which is my magical secret garden retelling. And this actually just got the Catholic Writers Guild seal of approval. So I was very just pumped about that. It's super Catholic. And then the first one, I guess, is The Circus of Stolen Dreams, which is available on Lorelei, Savaryn.com, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. I also write monthly for Catholic moms. You can find more of my writing there or at This Catholic Family on Substack.
Well, I'm so glad both of you accepted my invitation, because I've been wanting to have a conversation about the Catholic perspective on fiction from people who've had encounters with an evangelical perspective on fiction. And after I brought in Rhonda to tape The Journey Home recently, I was like, I finally got a second novelist for this panel. So it's so great to be able to bring this all kind of to bear. And it really is a different way of thinking about the world and about art that's sometimes hard to explain to our brothers and sisters from the evangelical world that we came from. And how you can't just slap a Christian stamp on something and suddenly it's magically got a Christian worldview. So there's more to it than that. But we've got links to Lorelei and Rhonda's work in the show notes here. So check out in the description, you can find that. You can go to CHNetwork.org and see them both on the journey home and hear their stories of how they ended up in the Catholic faith from their various backgrounds. And of course, we have an online community as well. Community.chnetwork.org is full of people who come from all kinds of different backgrounds who are supporting one another as they explore questions of faith. And this is all made possible by the generous support of our partners in mission. And if you want to join them to help us keep making content like this and starting conversations like this, then go to chnetwork.org/compass. Lorelei, Rhonda, thank you so much for your time today. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Matt.